Your phone rings from a number you don't recognize. You almost don't answer. You do. And a voice says your full name, not hello. Not is this your actual full name, like they've been waiting for you. They tell you there's a complaint against you. 48 hours, they say, before it gets formalized with the county. After that, there's nothing they can do. A warrant gets issued, your license gets suspended, and this becomes a criminal matter instead of a financial one. Your heart is already pounding before you've said a word. They know your address. They know about a loan you took out years ago and barely remember. And somewhere underneath the panic, a single question is trying to break through. How do they know all of this? Here's the part that should terrify you more than any of it. For thousands of people across the country, none of what they were told was true. Not the complaint, not the warrant, not the county deadline ticking down in the background of every call. In some cases, not even the debt itself. One of the women they targeted told them, plainly, that she was disabled and couldn't work. Another told them she was homeless. They kept calling anyway. This wasn't a scam that slipped through the cracks for a few weeks before someone caught it. Federal prosecutors would later call it, without exaggeration, the largest criminal debt collection scheme ever charged. It ran for 5 years. Add this one to the ledger. Scroll 1. The setup. Buffalo, New York, 2009. A company called 4-Star Resolution opens its doors. On paper looking like nothing more than a debt collection agency, the kind of business that exists by the thousands across the country, chasing down unpaid bills for a cut of whatever they recover. At the top of it were two men, Travel Thomas, the owner, CEO and president, and Morris Sessom, his co-owner and chief financial officer. Together they built out 4 separate offices in Buffalo, hiring managers, hiring collectors, building what looked, from the outside, like an ordinary operation. But 4-Star wasn't really in the business of collecting debts. It was in the business of manufacturing fear and dressing that fear up as paperwork. Thomas personally wrote the scripts his collectors would read off, word for word, to strangers on the other end of the phone. Scripts built entirely around one idea: make the person on the other end believe they were already in legal trouble. Between 2010 and 2015, using dozens of aliases and company names, Consumer Recovery Group, 4-Star Capital Services, FS Mediation Group collectors placed calls to consumers across the entire country. And what they said on those calls wasn't collection. It was theatre. Scroll 2. The mechanism. Here's how the machine actually worked, piece by piece, because the mechanism is what makes this story different from an ordinary scam. If a collector couldn't reach someone, they'd leave a message about possible litigation and a deadline. 48 hours, the message said, before the complaint became formal with the county. Most people don't know what formalizing a complaint with the county even means. That's exactly the point. It sounds official enough to work, and vague enough that nobody could disprove it. When someone did call back, the deception escalated fast. Collectors would falsely identify themselves as attorneys, investigators, process servers, court officials, or in some calls as government agents and law enforcement. They'd tell victims they'd committed a crime. Wire fraud, check fraud, words designed to turn a debt into something that sounded criminal, something a person might pay anything to make disappear. And behind the scenes, in 4-Star's own collection software, the balances themselves were often inflated larger than what the person actually owed, sometimes larger than any debt that existed at all. Fake documents were emailed to victims to make the threat feel real. If someone still hesitated, 4-Star escalated to a coordinated mailing campaign, physical letters designed to look like they came from a law office, reinforcing everything the phone calls had already threatened. Scroll 3. The 5 lies. To understand how this worked on thousands of different people, in thousands of different situations, court filings actually broke the deception down into 5 distinct lies. A menu of fear 4-Star's collectors could mix and match depending on what worked on you. The first lie was affiliation. Collectors claimed 4-Star was connected to local government and law enforcement, sometimes invoking the county by name. sometimes claiming a tie to the district attorney's office itself. A person hearing that doesn't think debt collector. They think, I'm in trouble with the law. The second lie turned an unpaid bill into a crime. Collectors told victims they'd personally committed wire fraud or check fraud, and that if they didn't pay immediately, a warrant would follow, then an arrest. Imagine believing, even for an afternoon, that a bill you forgot about might end with handcuffs. The third lie targeted something almost everyone depends on without thinking about it. Pay now, collectors said, or your driver's license gets suspended. For someone who needs to drive to work, to pick up their kids, to survive their daily life, that threat lands harder than almost any other. The fourth lie borrowed the authority of the legal profession itself. 4-Star told victims they were a law firm or a mediation firm, and that actual lawyers, mediators, or arbitrators were involved in their case. A stranger on the phone suddenly sounds like someone with the power to end your life as you know it. And the fifth lie was the closer, for anyone still hesitating. A civil lawsuit, they said, had already been filed or was not a threat of future consequences. A claim that the consequences had already begun. 5 lies, endlessly recombined, aimed at whichever fear was most likely to make a specific person pick up the phone and pay. This wasn't one bad actor improvising. It was a designed system, built to find the exact pressure point in every single victim who answered. Scroll 4. Not an isolated case. Now here's a detail that should widen the fear this story creates rather than settle it. 4-Star wasn't operating alone, and it wasn't even the only Buffalo-based debt collection ring the government moved against that same week. On the very same day federal regulators filed their complaint against 4-Star, they also filed against a separate company, Vantage Point Services, a different operation, in the same city, running a strikingly similar playbook of threats and false claims against consumers nationwide. Together, the two operations were responsible for more than $45 million in supposed debts, extracted through nearly identical tactics. This wasn't one company's rogue scheme. It was a pattern regulators were watching emerge in more than one place at once. That should change how you think about a call like this. The fear. 4-Star Manufactured wasn't unique to 4-Star. It was a business model. Other operators were independently discovering worked in the same industry, in the same city, at the same time. Scroll 5. The predation. Now here's where this story stops being a scam story and becomes something closer to predation. Court filings described collectors specifically pressing victims who told them directly why they couldn't pay. One woman told collectors she was physically disabled and unable to work. Another told them she was homeless. Both were pressured anyway. Prosecutors would later say Thomas and Sesam's collectors took ruthless advantage of people already in the most desperate moments of their lives, not despite their vulnerability, but because of it. A person with nothing left to lose is easier to frighten into paying something they don't have. For 5 years, this ran almost entirely unnoticed by the people it was hurting. Victims didn't know they'd been targeted by a company running scripted lies out of a call center. They only knew a stranger on the phone seemed to know things about them and seemed capable of ruining their life if they didn't pay. By the time regulators finally moved to shut it down, 4-Star and its related entities had pulled in more than $31 million from thousands of victims across the country. Money extracted almost entirely through fear, not through debts that were properly owed or properly verified. And where did that money actually go? Investigators found hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled straight into Thomas and Sesam's personal lives. Gambling, professional sports season tickets, even Thomas's own wedding reception, all paid for, in part, with money taken from people who told their collectors they had nothing left. Scroll 6. The unraveling. In February 2015, the Federal Trade Commission and the New York Attorney General moved together, filing a joint complaint to shut the operation down for good. A federal court issued an immediate order halting 4-Star's practices. But a civil shutdown wasn't the end of this. It was only the beginning of a much bigger reckoning. Federal prosecutors in Manhattan opened a criminal investigation, And in October 2015, an indictment came down, not just against Thomas and Sessom, but against 8 of their employees as well. Wire fraud, the charges read, for a scheme prosecutors called the largest of its kind ever brought. One by one, the people underneath Thomas and Sessom began to plead guilty and cooperate. 4 employees first, then more. By the time prosecutors were done, all 14 people charged in connection with 4-Star had been convicted. Nobody who was part of the machine walked away clean. Thomas himself pleaded guilty in November 2016 to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The man who wrote the scripts, who built the fear into a business model, stood in front of a federal judge and admitted what he'd built. Scroll 7. Consequences and takeaway. In April 2017, sentencing came down. Travel Thomas, the mastermind, in the words of the US Attorney's Office, was sentenced to 100 months in federal prison, 8 1/3 years, for turning strangers' desperation into a business plan. Maurice Sessom received 90 months. Both men were ordered to forfeit the full $31 million their scheme had extracted, along with years of supervised release once they eventually walk free. The FTC and New York Attorney General followed with permanent bans for Thomas, Sessom, and every company and alias connected to 4-Star were barred from the debt collection industry for life, backed by a $30 million civil judgment. What's striking, looking back at this case, isn't just the scale. It's how ordinary the whole operation looked from the outside for 5 straight years, an office building in Buffalo, employees showing up to work, a business card that said Consumer Recovery Group instead of what it actually was. Nobody who received one of those calls could see any of that. They just heard a voice that sounded official, threatening consequences that sounded real, counting down a clock that didn't actually exist. So here's the uncomfortable truth this story leaves behind. The next call that tells you a warrant is coming in 48 hours might be exactly what it sounds like, or it might be 4-Star's next imitator. Reading from a script somebody else wrote, betting that fear will do what the truth never could. Add it to the ledger. This one just cost $31 million and it took 5 years of victims, sounding the alarm before anyone with power actually listened. But debt collectors weren't the only ones who figured out that hiding behind fine print pays better than telling the truth. The Ticketmaster story is proof this playbook runs all the way up to a $20 billion company. Watch that one next.